I don't understand how people don't see the sequence of things that happened that led to all of this. It's just, it is so logical along the way. Like, was I the only one that was paying attention in grade 8 or whenever we learned about the moon stuff? Like, I just look at the timeline of how incredible this achievement was. And like I said, the hardest thing by far is getting off the Earth. So for all the people who think this is the thing that just blows my mind, what I actually want is I want to interview somebody who's actually a moon landing denier. And I got to ask some questions. I got to be like, okay, I understand you think Stanley Kubrick videoed the Apollo 11 moon landing, right? Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, that mission was all a hoax, right? I get it that that's what they think. Do they think everything else was videoed as well? Like, do they think that Apollo 11 was like in a bubble? We just decided to throw 3 guys in a tin can and shoot them off to the moon and nothing happened before that? There was no buildup before that and after that as well? Like, do they know we went 5 more times and 12 Americans have walked on the moon? Did Stanley Kubrick actually video not only Apollo 11, but when the Russians and the British and the Japanese and the Indian space agencies, of course, the Americans don't own the airways. Radio waves are available to anybody who points in the right direction. So this was all confirmed as it was happening. But if something was fishy, how did Stanley Kubrick manage to videotape Apollo 11, 12, 13, of course, the oxygen failure, but 14, 15, 16, 17, how did he do this? He's like Jason Bourne. Can you imagine? The whole world thinks you lied about Apollo 11, and he somehow managed to videotape 12 to 17 as well. And none of the 400,000 people working at NASA were like, wait a second, I'm going to keep a little closer eye on this guy because I don't believe that. I'm going to scout out the Arizona desert and see what's going on. But I just want to ask somebody who doesn't believe in the moon landing, how much of it don't you believe, right? When is the line where you're like, okay, because if you look at the timeline, it just seems like the most logical thing in the world to me. So 1957, I'm going to go off on a moon rant. Give me 5 minutes here and then we'll wrap it up. 1957, the Soviets test the first intercontinental ballistic missile, right? It goes up, parabolic route, 6,000 miles it travels. Totally successful. ICBMs are invented. The Americans get it a few months later, but that is an incredible achievement, right? They've built rockets with enough thrust to do a parabolic move on the Earth and land 6,000 miles away. That's incredible. Did Stanley Kubrick videotape that? Because that is a bigger achievement than putting your foot on the moon, in my opinion. Getting the rocket technology to get off the Earth is the game. That is the game. Once you do that, everything else is a cakewalk. So 1957, 12 years before the moon landing, the Soviets have ICBMs. Is that fake? Did Stanley Kubrick get paid for that gig as well? Or did the Russians have their own videographer? Later that year, the Russians are like, okay, we just did a big parabolic move here. Well, why don't we just throw something on there and just drop it off in space? So 1957, Sputnik, they put something about this big, weighs 200 pounds. They're like, why don't we just drop this off in space? They put Sputnik into orbit, the first satellite in space. 1957, 12 years before the Apollo mission, they put Sputnik in space. Is that fake? Did he videotape that as well? All right, it's crazy. And then think about you're the Soviets. The Americans haven't started their space program yet. You're the Soviets. Okay, well, we built the rocket. Now we put a satellite in space. What's the next logical step? Let's put a dog in there. That's a good idea. Let's put a dog in there. So Laika, the dog, goes into the capsule that Sputnik was, and they drop a dog off in orbit. Now, unfortunately, of course, at the time, they didn't really have good heat shield technology. You can imagine what happened when, poor old Laika was doing laps of the Earth. Got a little hot in there, and he didn't make it. But the Sputnik program kept going, and the Russians are doing what Russians would do. They're doing what we would do. They're doing what I would do. Well, if we've done that, why don't we just go a little bit further and do that? So they kept doing that, and they got up, what was it, Sputnik 7 or Sputnik 8? They put like 2 dogs, a rabbit, a pig, like a bunch of mice, fruits and vegetables. They fired a whole farm up there. And it worked. And they brought them back. They brought the two dogs back alive. So now, this is like 1959, 1960. They've got the technology to put life forms in orbit and get them back to Earth. That's the game. It's a wrap. Now we can walk on the moon, right? That's what the Americans were thinking. And then what do the Russians do then? You can imagine the scenario, right? They're in this big situation room. They've already put dogs and pigs and fruits and vegetables. Of course, Yuri Gagarin is sitting there at the end of the table. He's slouching down in his chair because he doesn't want to get called on by the teacher or something. And so one of the generals is like, why don't we put Yuri in the tin can and throw him up there? So that's what they do. They throw this guy in the tin can. They put him in orbit. What is that, 1961? April 1961, Yuri Gagarin, first man in space. Was that fake? Did Stanley Kubrick video that? Because that was confirmed by the Americans. That was the reason that Kennedy, in May of 1961, made his famous speech, "We are going to the moon." Why did he do it so boldly? Because the Russians had already solved walking on the moon. They had already done it, right? The hard part is over. If you can get a life form off of Earth and back onto Earth, the game is done. So Kennedy and NASA and his engineers told him, why don't you just announce that we're going to walk on the moon within 10 years? Because the Russians have already solved the complicated issues. We can totally do this, right? And then you add another aspect to it. What was it? Soviet Luna 2. What year would that have been? 1959? Soviet Luna 2, they pointed their R-7 rockets and they hit the moon. They calculated the exact trajectory. They fired off their rockets in empty space. They calculated the moon's going to swing around and they hit the moon with rockets. Soviet Luna 2 in 1959. Again, 10 years before the Apollo mission, they hit the moon with a rocket. And not only did they hit the moon, but that rocket was able to detect that the moon has no magnetic field. It has no radiation belts of any kind. We knew it didn't have any atmosphere. It has 1/6 Earth's gravity. It's the easiest celestial body in the world to land on, right? I mean, you talk about the Earth, super thick atmosphere, magnetic fields, all of this stuff. Landing on the moon's cakewalk, right? So that's what Kennedy was thinking. Like, let's just announce this. Should we keep going? Because this is kind of like cool stuff to me. I don't know if I'm alone here. Is there a single person left? But okay, keep going. Then the Soviet missions keep going. The Americans enter the race, but they don't have rockets that can do any of this yet. The Soviets were beating the Americans every step of the way. And so the Americans made their decision that ended up right around 1961, that was the reason that they touched down on the moon first. It was a weird, early on decision that nobody knew would be this critical, but it was. That the Soviet, what are they, R-7, N-5 rockets, they are very powerful, right? The ICBMs that can thrust 18,000 miles per hour, they've got enough thrust to get there. But they're basically just gaffer taping like 20 or 30 of them together and firing them off onto the, hitting the moon from 250,000 miles away. That's an incredible feat, but it is just a math equation, right? But anyway, their rockets are very dangerous. They're very unreliable. The Americans have the Saturn V rocket system, which is just 5 very large rockets put together, much fewer moving parts. They allow for very small micro-telemetry adjustments. So if anything goes wrong in a launch, you get a little bit higher probability of it being successful. The Russians were finding out that it's actually pretty difficult to have 30 bombs strapped to themselves, light it on fire, and have it not blow up before you exit Earth's atmosphere. So the Saturn V rockets is really what did it for the Americans. Because once you look at the Apollo mission itself, like I said, the hardest thing is to get off Earth, by far. Elon Musk will say the same thing right now. Elon Musk is finding that out, that rockets do blow up because they're very powerful and it's very hard to exit Earth. Once you do that, it's just a breeze to get there. So Apollo 1 was supposed to be the mission where they put their astronauts into Earth's orbit. Unfortunately, what we all saw, it was obviously a tragedy. There was a fire, cockpit fire. All of the Apollo 1 astronauts were lost. That is very, very sad. And of course, it sets the program back. But just timeline-wise, if you just think about it, because the Soviets have already solved all the complicated problems, right? Getting off Earth was what they did, and they did it first, and that's the game. The Americans now know that they can just fast-track this. Once you get a rocket that can get out of Earth's atmosphere, it's over. You're on the moon. So Apollo 1, blows up. Apollo 2, 3, 4. They do a bunch of testing. They fix their rocket system. I think Apollo 4 was the first one where it was unmanned. So the lunar module is the same lunar module as Apollo 11, but there's no men inside, right? They're going to be safe this time around. They're going to slow roll it a little bit. It was supposed to be Apollo 1, but they delayed. So Apollo 4, in my opinion, again, is a far greater achievement than Apollo 11, even though it doesn't make for a great movie. Getting an unmanned 3-person capsule off of the Earth and back on safely, Apollo 4, that was the achievement. Once you can do that, again, you're at the moon, basically, because it's so easy to land on the moon. So then follow the logic. Apollo 5, 6, they do some testing. Apollo 7, they put 3 dudes in the capsule and they go out to Earth, right? They orbit the Earth. Now they're basically done. They could have gone to the moon and landed on it on Apollo 8 if they wanted, but because of what happens on Apollo 1, they are a little bit cautious of what's going on. So Apollo 8, exit Earth's atmosphere, hardest job by far, and they go to the moon, right? The Russians already did it in 1959. They hit the moon. You can calculate how to get there, right? So they hit the moon and they orbit the moon. That's a tremendous achievement. They could just land on the moon at that point. Apollo 8 could have done it if they didn't have to be careful. Because all you really have to do to land on the moon is you basically just slow down. I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but you basically just have to slow down. Because if you're in lunar orbit, you are essentially stationary. And then you just slow down and the moon pulls you in, very low gravity, no magnetic field, no atmosphere, no heat shield required, none of that crap. Just reverse thrusters and you're good to go. Just, don't crash land is all it is. But you just decentric circles down and boom, you're on the moon. But they don't do that. Apollo 8 goes back to the Earth. Astronauts give the thumbs up. They say we're all good. Apollo 9, 2 months later, Apollo 9 goes. What do? They could have landed on the moon as well, but they wanted to go there and be cautious, so fine. So they go, they orbit the moon, they separate, they redock, and they go back to Earth. Thumbs up. 2 months later, Apollo 10. So they're doing this quickly, right? Apollo 10 goes out there, and what did they do? What was the thing about Apollo 10? So they go to the moon, they separate. They could have touched down on the moon. Again, just separate and slow down, and you're going to hit the moon. But what do? They go about halfway down. They test everything out. They go back up. They redock, and they go back to Earth. Apollo 11 comes. This is the big one. Exiting Earth's atmosphere is by far the hardest part of this whole job. Getting 3 men in a capsule off of the Earth. I mean, talk about an engineering problem. But then you just point in the right direction and you just go to the moon. You just orbit the moon, slow down, and you hit the moon. It's just the easiest thing in the world. So this is the thing that I don't understand is how can you doubt the easiest part of the mission and not recognize the decade-long of achievements along the way? Like, how does this phone work? This makes no sense. If you were to tell somebody, you can just pick up this little box, you can just talk into it, and somebody in China can hear you. You would look at that and you would say, like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. But if you do it like an engineer would do it, very small incremental changes, just stand on the shoulders of the people that came before you and make incremental changes. You can build really cool stuff. You can put your foot, Neil Armstrong can walk on the moon, not because Neil Armstrong did anything special, but because going all the way back from the ICBMs that already did a parabola around the Earth, the Sputnik, putting a dude in there, Yuri Gagarin, and then Soviet Luna 2. Soviet Luna 9 was 1966. That was before the Apollo program even started. The Soviets had already soft landed on the moon, taken imagery, and sent it back to Earth. They had done testing. They had tested the atmosphere and all this stuff that happened before the Apollo mission even started. So the groundwork was laid. It's just that Saturn V rocket had so few errors, relatively speaking. They did have one problem, but relatively speaking, it was the Saturn V rocket. Otherwise, the Soviets would have beat them easily. They just, couldn't figure out how to make them stop blowing up like that. But and then after Apollo 11, I guess they could go back a few more times, right? So they go back on Apollo 12. Totally successful, just, uneventful. Apollo 13 was fine. They got off Earth. Nothing to do with the moon landing, just happened to have an oxygen breach on the way there. So they had to turn back. That was that famous movie. Apollo 14 was pretty cool. That was the first time that they took that little battery powered foldable cart so that they could, the first mission, Apollo 11, they collected like 20 kilograms of moon rocks and they brought it back to Earth and distributed around all the scientific community. And it's really cool. And, everybody gets a little piece of, every country gets a little piece of the moon rock. That's amazing. But they built this little foldable cart, right? And they makes it a little bit easier to go on the moon and get your moon rocks. And Apollo 15, of course, the famous rover, right? That's when that happened. You've got the lunar lander, and the engineers know these things. They know how much weight they can have. They know how much space they can do. And they're like, you know what we should do? We should just have a foldable little buggy, and we should just take that and rip around the moon. And of course, now you can drive really far away from the moon landing and you can explore more of the moon. And that was pretty cool. But again, the Soviets were the first ones to have a moon rover successfully on the moon, right? It wasn't manned, but the Soviet rover was 1970. Apollo 15 was 1971 or 1972, maybe early 72. So the Soviets beat the Americans. The Soviets beat the Americans at every single step of the space race, literally every one, from ICBMs to the satellite in space, to the man in space, to hitting the moon. Not only did they hit the moon, but they also crash landed probes on Venus and Mars before the Americans did. Like the Soviets laid the groundwork for all of this. The only difference was the Americans had the rockets that were very reliable, and you could just, every 2 months, you could just fire another Apollo mission. And there you go. They did all the cool shit. Apollo 16, 17. I think it was canceled like probably in 71, they canceled the program. But because the astronauts had already been training, they basically just said, okay, we'll continue with 16 and 17. We'll rip around on the same rover. We'll hit some golf balls, do some stuff like that. But it was basically done. There's nothing on the moon. But that brings us to Artemis. A geek like me, what I find so interesting is, like I said, Artemis is a program with a purpose. I guess you could say the purpose was to beat the Soviets because they were damn near building Starbucks on the moon before Apollo even started, right? So they were winning at every step of the way. But Artemis is different because they're not going back to the moon landing sites, right? There's like 5 or 6 different moon landing sites. It's all been confirmed by flybys, and 5 different space agencies have taken pictures of it. It's all there. The reflectors are on the moon. They always have been. All of this is just totally confirmed. But the Artemis program is interesting because the moon is tidal locked to the Earth, of course, right? Everybody knows that the moon, we should call it the far side of the moon, but because of the Pink Floyd album, we call it the dark side of the moon. It's not actually dark. The sun hits it all the time, but it's dark to us because we can only see the tidal locked moon and the one face. But basically the way that the moon orbits the Earth and the way the Earth orbits the sun and the way the sun is blasting through the Milky Way galaxy, which is like disc-shaped, it means that the angle of the light hitting the moon, the southern pole of the moon, has really deep craters that the sun doesn't penetrate. So they think that there's actually ice inside those deep craters on the southern pole of the moon. So the Artemis program is going to land maybe there or maybe near there. Maybe these are massive mountains, but I don't know how they're going to do it exactly. But if you could actually convert ice, which is presumably inside those dark craters, into, you separate liquid hydrogen and oxygen, and liquid oxygen, you can make rocket fuel out of it. You could actually, this is ambitious, probably 5 or 10 years from now, but you could legitimately make yourself a spacecraft on the moon and take off from the moon as a launching pad. Because again, getting on and off the moon it couldn't be easier. It's like if you custom designed a celestial body that is the easiest thing to land on, a tidal locked, no atmosphere, low gravity, no magnetic pole, no heat shields required. What are we doing here? Like if you used the moon as a launching pad and you could make your own liquid oxygen, well, now you're onto something, right? And then you can just launch and reboard, and you wouldn't have to do the extremely difficult engineering task of getting off the Earth every time, which is ridiculously expensive. It's incredibly dangerous. Even now today, that is no small feat. If you could do it from the moon, now we're onto something, right? Then you could springboard to Mars, because you could build a ship that is custom designed, easily get off the moon, custom designed to land on Mars, which has its own set of problems, right? Landing on Mars should be much easier than landing on Earth, because it is a little bit smaller, the gravity thing. The atmosphere is like 1 or 2% the Earth. But the problem is the heat on the entry would actually be very, very difficult. So you would need a high quality spacecraft to land on the moon or to land on Mars. The lunar lander, you could literally almost make it a paper bag, to be honest. Like obviously space has no air. There's really no reason that, as long as it's strong enough to be accelerated, from Earth, and nothing terrible happens on the exit from the Earth, at that point, a plastic bag could make it to the moon. But getting to Mars does actually require a very structurally sound craft. So build it on the moon, blast it off with the moon ice converted to liquid oxygen. There, what do they say? Bob's your uncle. We're on Mars now, right? And you could go back and you could see the crash site from the original probe that the Soviets crash landed on Mars again before the Americans. So all of this, where did Stanley Kubrick come in to all of this, right? Like, what part of this did he decide that he's going to videotape? I don't get it. How could people look at what happened in those 12 years and not just feel inspiration, first of all, just proud to be human at that point? Like, I'm Canadian, I'm not American, but proud to be American, but proud to just be a human. That is some cool stuff that they achieved. To deny that, because essentially an argument from personal incredulity, right? That's because you don't understand how something can be done, therefore it didn't happen. That's a fallacy. Just because you don't understand how they did it doesn't mean they didn't do it. They did that. It's confirmed. All the space agencies tracked the telemetries, confirmed everything. Soviets didn't deny it because they can intercept the same radio waves that the Americans can. Those signals came from the moon. All of it confirmed. Even now, you can go to the store and you can buy a telescope and you can see the reflectors. Like, what are we talking about here? Just because people have personal incredulity about something doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just means that you don't understand it. That's what that means. It means you need to study more. Roll up your sleeves and get to work. Actually study it. Don't just say, 3 men can't get in a tin can and fire up 250,000 miles and land on the moon and come back safely. And turns out, they can. If you make small incremental improvements along the way, there isn't a whole lot we can't do, right? My phone works. I'm live streaming right now on a computer that if you gave me 1 billion years, I couldn't build this computer. But if you give a bunch of engineers enough time and you say, okay, you're allowed to study everything that came before this moment. And then you need to improve on it a little bit. Boom, I've got a computer that can broadcast to the world. Could I build this? No. But that's a personal incredulity thing. I don't know how to build a computer, so computers don't exist? That's stupid. I'm not a computer engineer. Of course, I don't know how. But computer science people do. Engineers do. It's the same thing with the moon program. Just because you don't know how they did it doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? So I don't know how you say all this without being completely rude to people who deny it all. Like, how can you deny the awe-inspiring achievement and not be super pumped about the Artemis program? Did you see those pictures that they're sending back? Did you see? That is incredible, right? Of course, we can all point a telescope to the moon and we can take a really great picture of the moon. We've got technology that we can all do that. But I'm sorry, I can't take a picture of an Earthrise. That is just, it's just so cool to see that. I don't know why. Am I the only one who thinks this stuff is incredible? But yeah, there you go. What was that? 20-minute moon landing spiel.